Welcome to Total Spectrum Spotlight, an informative look and an insightful discussion of today's legislative issues and political trends.
Hi, I'm Congressman Eric Paulsen, and welcome to Spotlight. With me today is Kevin Hassett, who is the chairman of the White House's Council of Economic Advisors, and he is now a distinguished visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution. Kevin, it is great to see you. Thanks for being with us today. Well, let's just jump right into it. Look, consumer inflation is really at its highest level it's been in 40 years now. The March numbers reported at about 8.5% year over year, but that's a year over year number. It's probably higher inflation, well north of 10%. People certainly feel that with the gas pumps, groceries, et cetera. Now, some have speculated that inflation may have peaked, but it's very likely inflation is going to stay high regardless. So when will inflation peak in your estimation, and what will it take to get it back into the bottle?
Yeah, thanks. You know, you're exactly right to point to the numbers, and I know that one of the reasons why people love to watch your broadcast is they get to do math in their heads, right, while we're doing it. But the bottom line is that if you do the math in your head, there wasn't much inflation for the first half of last year. Or the last 12 months. But then in the second half, it got really out of control. And so if you look at an average over a time when there's kind of a low inflation and a high inflation, then you get a number that's not so bad. But if you look at the current trajectory for consumer prices, then I think that inflation right now is running at a rate of about 14%. We could go into why, but it's well north of 10%. For exactly the reason that you described. And so, for some reason, and I think it's in part because the media is so biased in favor of this administration, that whenever there's a number that comes out that's bad for Biden, then they find the best way to characterize it possible. And so they've decided they're going to look at the year-over-year number rather than like the last 3 months or something like that. And so if they stick with that, then for sure the year-over-year number is going to continue to go up because we're averaging over a year with a whole bunch of higher numbers in it. Like we're tossing out the low numbers right from 14 months ago. And the bottom line, though, is that if you look at what we've been teaching in economics classes for as long as I can remember, then if you ask a undergraduate or even like now they teach economics in high school, as a high school student, if the government wants to stimulate the economy, what do? Then they'll basically say, well, they should run a deficit. They should spend a lot of money, and then Keynes tells us that makes the economy grow faster. Right. So are we running a deficit right now? Yeah, of course. And so that on the fiscal policy side, it's stimulative inflationary. On the monetary policy side, then people would basically say, well, the monetary policy is stimulative if the interest rate is below the natural rate of interest, which is usually like the estimates of it vary from like 5 to 6%. And so the interest rate is 4% or more below that even after Fed actions, recent Fed actions. And so monetary policy is putting its foot on the accelerator as well. And so if monetary policy and fiscal policy are both like pedal to the metal, then it's hard to imagine that inflation will go down.
So we have not peaked at this point,
no, we
right?
Have not peaked. And not even close.
And then to get it back in the bottle, what's going to have to take place?
When I tell you, I'm glad you're sitting down. I just discussed this with my friend Michael Bordeaux, who, if you haven't heard from him, is kind of like the heir to Milton Friedman. He's the greatest living, student of monetary history. And I ran by him something that I saw in the data, and I said, am I crazy to think this? And so he could back away from this if he doesn't like what we're talking about. But I said, when I look at the data, inflation doesn't start to go down until the interest rate's greater than the inflation rate in U.S. history. And so think about that. We just said that it's 14% inflation. Right. I'm not saying that interest rates are going to get that high, but what's going to happen is the Fed's going to move 50 basis points, 50 basis points, 50 basis points, and they're still going to be way below where they need to be to slow inflation. So inflation's going to stay high or even accelerate. And then at some point, the Fed's going to have to do something severe. And my view is that the typical viewer will know that we're reversing inflation when they see like an utter collapse of the stock market. Right now, there's been, in fact, here's a not so fun fact. So that the year-to-date return on the S&P 500 and the year-to-date return on the NASDAQ are both the worst on record. And so as you've seen, equity markets have been going down, and now year-to-date is kind of a weird number. It's starting from January 1st, but despite that, we haven't had the capitulation that would set off the kind of panic and recession, deep recession that would slow inflation. And so I'm guessing we're in a recession now. I know we're going to talk about that in a little bit, but it's not a deep enough one to get 14% inflation down to 2%. And so I think if I had to guess, if I was testifying before your committee like I used to do, I would say, probably inflation's going to average around 7% over the next decade, something like that.
Well,
it's going to take them a really long time to get it under control.
Take a long time, and that's a pretty high rate. I know the president likes to brag that wages have been going up, but prices are going up 2 to 3 times faster than wage growth or workers' paychecks. So I remember back in the 1970s, right, wages and prices were moving up in a self-feeding spiral. So no country wants to be in a wage price spiral. Is that where we are right now in the United States?
You're exactly right. We are in a wage price spiral. And what tends to happen is that in a wage price spiral, the first thing that happens is that prices go up. So maybe we should call it a price wage spiral, right, in some sense, because the first move is the price.
Sure.
So the price goes up, and then the firm makes more money because you're paying the workers, not that much relative to the current higher price. And so you see profits go up a lot, and we saw that at the beginning, especially last fall. But then the workers say, oh, wait a minute, I'm worse off because by the time I'm done with buying groceries and gas, I have way less money than I had last year. So and also look at your prices, they're going up a lot. You got to increase my wage. And so then the employer increases the wage with a lag, usually over the next year. And then with the higher wage, the cost for the employer goes up, so they have to lift the price again. And the history of wage price spirals is that the price always wins in the race. And so the wage is chasing the price up the spiral, but it never catches it. And so real wages decline. And so right now, real wage growth in the U.S., which is adjusting for inflation or actually like your real welfare, is declining at about a 4% annual rate. And the negative shock to the economy, and this is one of the reasons why I'm sure we're in recession, is bigger than that because of all of the COVID relief that's disappearing. And so I don't know any elected official ever that follows numbers as closely as you, so I'm going to ask you a question which I bet you'll get wrong.
Okay.
But it's a quiz. Okay, so the year over year, real disposable income is what you have after taxes and transfers and after you get your wages. And what's the current latest read on the year-over-year change for real disposable income? So, which is actually like how much money ordinary Americans have in their household. What's the percent
ordinary
change?
Americans, I thought, had like $5,000 less in their pockets than they did, for instance, a year ago. It's going down. But you said I'm going to get this wrong, so.
Yeah, well, the $5,000 is it's a little low
okay.
Because of the government transfers, but you got the private sector right. So to get a B+.
Okay.
But if you remove the transfers, then the decline in disposable income in real terms and add inflation back in is 20%.
Right.
Year over year, 20%. And so the question is, if you have a 20% decline in income for ordinary Americans, then how do you not have a recession? And what's been happening is that we gave so much cash to people during the COVID situation, especially in the first year of the Biden administration, that people saved a lot. And they're sort of spending down those savings right now, even though their incomes aren't keeping up with inflation. And so that's keeping demand kind of high and consumption kind of high, so that the sort of consumption side of GDP has been doing okay, but the income side is terrible. And the consumption side always catches up to the income side. And we saw that in the first quarter. The first quarter posted a minus 1.4% GDP growth number. And looking back, that's a pretty big negative number, as you know. And I looked back, and 95% of the time since the Second World War, when you had a number that was minus 1.4% or larger, then it was in a recession.
Okay.
Or in something that was about to start, a recession that was about to start, 95% of the time. So I'm kind of 95% sure we're in a recession right now.
So just in terms of our state of our economy, you think 95% we're in a recession right now. So disappointing number last quarter, obviously, on the growth being a negative number. But look, unemployment's at a near 50-year low. Fourth quarter GDP was actually pretty good. So explain why those confluences could actually signal we're heading towards a recession or we're in a recession.
Right. So the thing about unemployment, first thing is that unemployment is low, but employment is low as well. You can say, wait, what do we mean? Kevin, what are you talking about? And the fact is that because of COVID, all of the ground that was made up in the Trump years, where people who were on the sidelines that didn't have jobs joined the labor force, and labor force participation went way up. And we talked about this in your committee hearings, I can remember. And all of that is reversed. And so people left the labor force and they haven't really gone back in. And I think in part it's because the Democrats have removed a lot of work incentives from programs and they've given cash to people. They make more if they stay home, if they go to work, and so on. But the labor force participation rate right now is the lowest it's been. There's one other time in the last couple of decades. In 2015, it was this low. And so the unemployment rate is basically measured on, like, so the people who want to have a job or have a job, what percentage of them don't have a job? The problem is that there's a massive expansion of people who aren't in the labor force, they don't want to have a job. And so the unemployment rate looks okay, but the number of people employed doesn't. And so the history of it is that employment is a lagging indicator. And the reason is that there's this thing which people can Google. It's actually an interesting literature called labor hoarding. And the idea is that firms, it's so hard to find a good worker that they don't like to lay people off, even if they're losing money. And so you got to lose money for a while before you start laying people off. And sometimes it can take like a year or two for the employment numbers to catch up with the GDP numbers.
Well, you referenced the Fed earlier, and the Fed always wants to have a soft landing when they're raising interest rates to slow inflation, for instance. But they don't have a very good track record, right, on this front. I think in the last 25 years, we had something like 9 recessions, and maybe 1 out of the 9 has had a soft landing potentially. But why is that so hard for the Fed to have a soft landing?
Yeah, I think that soft landings can sort of happen. I think that the recession that started right after 9/11 was a pretty soft landing. It was a slow recovery, but not that deep a recession. And I think that might be the last soft landing. The thing is that right now, I would go further and say that, they talk about black swans, like things that you really just didn't expect would happen. If you list all the things that are going on in the world right now, like the highest inflation that we've had like forever, and at a time when I'm 95% sure we're in a recession, at a time when the Democrats are still proposing like enormously destructive policies, which I don't even know if we have time to talk about, at a time when Putin is attacking Ukraine, and I mean the energy prices are through the roof. So there are all these things that make it sort of almost miraculous that financial markets haven't had a panic and had a black swan negative event. But I think that the risks right now are the highest that I can remember for like a really, really deep dive, not just a recession.
Sure.
And so we're not going to soft land. I think that already the things we're seeing in the numbers, like minus 1.4%, if the number just sort of stays in that range for the recession, and we drop 2 or 3% in the recession, that would be one of the deepest ever. Recessions, it turns out, aren't really that bad very often. It's like 0.5% decline in GDP. And so the minus 1.4 is a big number, and it means that we've already seen that we're not having a soft landing.
Sure. You've served as an economic and a tax advisor to several elected leaders and presidential campaigns and candidates, and you certainly understand that public policy as a result is integrated in the state of our economy. So Congress and the President have now seemed to focus all of their policies on the demand side of economics, as we've talked about. Doesn't Washington need to put some emphasis on the supply side to address some of these inflationary pressures? And if they did, what would be 1 or 2 things they could focus on?
Yeah, that you're exactly right, and I think you have to start from something that would be like a long lecture, but I could say fast, which is everybody says Paul Volcker defeated inflation the last time we had it this high, but it's not true. He contributed, but it was really Ronald Reagan that defeated inflation, and I'm not being a partisan. Inflation happens when there's more demand than supply. And so if you want to get rid of inflation, if there's like 1 apple farmer who shows up at the farmer's market, then apples are going to be expensive. If 10 apple farmers come, then apples are going to be cheap. And so what you got to do is you got to get other guys to start orchards. And that's what Reagan did with his tax cuts and his pro-business policies. And so thing 1 is you got to end the assault on energy, the closing of pipelines, the massive increase in regulation, and the threatened massive tax hikes on businesses that the Biden administration has been tossing out there from the beginning, and that's had a really chilling effect on businesses' willingness to expand. But the second thing is that they've been removing work incentives, not only with the expanded UI benefit, but I'll give an example that it's maybe some people will find this too detailed, but it's really important because you have to understand how economically illiterate and destructive their policies are. that in the child tax credit, then the way it works, like when you were there helping to expand it and design it and make it sort of both child-friendly and economy-friendly, the way it works is that you don't get it unless you have $2,500 in income in the year.
Tied to work.
So it's tied to work. But then it goes up by 15 cents for every dollar you earn, up to a cap. And so what that means is that, like if you go to work for the Paulsen and Hassett Puck Company, where you talked about starting a hockey puck company, then instead of getting $1, which is what we pay you get $1.15. And so we're subsidizing people to work with the old child credit. Well, the Democrats say that's not fair. And so in the Build Back Better plan, what they do is they give the capped maximum credit to everybody regardless of income. And so they remove the work incentive. And so what did I just say was the number one supply constraint facing our economy right now? It's the fact that all these workers are on the sidelines. And if the workers are on the sidelines and then you remove work incentives, more workers are going to go on the sidelines. And so everywhere we look, there are policies that make that much sense that are being proposed by these guys. And the good news is that Joe Manchin has stood up to a lot of this, and there's an election coming, and hopefully there'll be a big obstacle to passing these policies that'll make it worse. To make it better, what we need to do is look for ways to expand labor force participation. In the Trump administration, we did a lot of things like we brought aggressive training programs into prisons and then let people out of prisons that were in there for like excessively high terms because of crack cocaine and so on. We changed the regulations for military spouses. We found there were like 600,000 unemployed military spouses because when they move with their spouse, with their husband to somewhere, then they can't get a job and their life.
And making the tax cuts permanent.
And making the tax cuts permanent would do
something.
it. And the expensing, which is the big incentive to invest, is going away. And so there are a lot of things that can be done. And I anticipate that the Congress, if it were to switch to being held by Republicans, would be able to work with President Biden. The history of Joe Biden, Joe Biden well, I know Joe Biden well, is that he's a political animal, but he is a guy who's willing to compromise.
Right.
And he's right now he's compromising with AOC. Right. But as soon as he's compromising with Kevin McCarthy, then I think that it's a much better place for the U.S. economy.
Small businesses are the engine of the economy, right, in the United States, and they tend to see the rising prices, the wage shortages, or worker shortages, some of the wage hikes first, right? They see these things first, and so small business optimism right now is at essentially plummeted to its lowest level we've ever seen in recent surveys, right?
Since World War II,
is it the fears of tax hikes or higher energy prices, labor shortages, a supply chain? Is it all those things that is?
It's a lot of those things, but the thing that we found about small businesses in the Trump administration was that regulation is like the number one concern for small businesses often. And the Biden administration, and this is stuff that's not been covered in the media, is basically fire hosing new regulations on small businesses in a way that's unprecedented. And the reason they're able to do that is one of Joe Biden's first executive orders was that it used to be, even under President Obama, that for a cabinet agency to pass, or any government agency to pass a new regulation, then it had to pass a cost-benefit test that was performed by the Office of Management and Budget. And that cost-benefit test, positive cost-benefit test, was a constraint on how fast regulations can grow. Well, Biden removed that constraint. And so now, if you're over in the Labor Department and you want to pass a new regulation and it's harmful to small business, then you can do it without any review, or you don't have to prove that there's a positive benefit to society.
Right.
And the problem with small businesses is that, like, IBM, if we change labor regulations, they got 1 million lawyers that are, on staff that are going to figure it out for them. Small business has got to hire people to study it and tell them what to do. And so when you put new regulations out there, especially, then you put an enormous burden on small businesses. And I think that that's the number one reason why their sentiment right now is worse than it's been since World War II. It's stunning.
Sure. You've kind of referenced this, but maybe just one final question. Most economists really did think that 2021 was going to be a record year for us because there were so many advantages as we entered 2021, right? We had hopefully the decline of COVID in the rearview mirror. You had life-saving vaccines out there. Regions of the country were finally opening, and the U.S. was supposed to really emerge very strong coming out of the pandemic. So what happened?
Joe Biden happened.
Well,
and I can see it really clearly in the data that, for example, One of the things you and I talked a lot about when we were helping people understand the benefits of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was that since we were the highest corporate tax place on earth, that U.S. multinationals were locating all their activity overseas so they didn't have to pay U.S. tax. And right when the tax cuts were passed, if you looked at just U.S. multinationals, 35% of their income was in the U.S., and the rest they were booking like in Ireland and overseas. The number reversed. And so right before Joe Biden took office, and actually I did this calculation pre-COVID too, because I didn't want COVID to be messing up the numbers. But right before COVID started, multinationals had gone to booking 65% of their income in the U.S. And so think about that. They repatriated about $2 trillion, and their new intellectual property and their new factories were all going in the U.S. Well, as soon as Biden took office, that stopped. And so it's back down into the 30s again, the share of multinational income that's in the U.S. And it's because he's threatened huge tax hikes. He's regulating them within an inch of their lives. And so it's not safe to have a U.S. parented company anymore on earth. And so everybody's fleeing the U.S. And people are fleeing the U.S. the same reason that they're fleeing California and that they're fleeing New York State, because these socialists have terrible ideas.
Yeah, and the irony to me is that everyone wants to have American manufacturing, seeing what's happened with our supply chains and the challenges with the pandemic. But that's what the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was designed to do, is bring the intellectual property back, bring the innovation back, bring the workers back to the United States and keep them here. You'd think everyone would want to do that.
Right.
So.
Yeah, and I don't understand why they're trying to reverse it. But again, one of the good things about public policy is that it can move forward over time because the evidence is overwhelming. And if you think about it, the Democrats with control of Congress and control of the White House have been unable to reverse our corporate tax cuts. And the reason they've been unable to reverse them is that first, there's a visible couple of people, Sinema and Manchin, that are saying, well, wait a minute, they seem to have worked. The corporate revenue now is way above where they said it would be because of the tax cuts. As a share of GDP, it's gone from 1.4% to 1.7%. After the tax cuts. And so it's not just the revenue going up because of GDP, but as a share of GDP, it's going up too because we had been bringing everything home. And the point is that my view is that it's not just Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema that look at that kind of evidence and sort of say, okay, we really shouldn't lift the corporate tax. But as you know, you have a lot of friends in the Senate that, like Amy Klobuchar, is a very sensible person. And she seemed less sensible on the campaign trail than in her office sometimes, right? But the fact is, somebody as smart and sensible as Amy Klobuchar is probably pretty convinced that the corporate taxes had their effect. And so I bet you there are a bunch of silent Democrats. They're letting Joe and Kristen take the heat. But they also agree that they don't want to do what Biden and AOC and the squad want, but that's good news because it means that as we move forward, there's a lot of opportunity for positive policy, and I think that again, if Joe Biden came in with a very difficult political problem, right? Bernie Sanders was about to win the nomination of that party before South Carolina, and so he had to really, really veer to the left to become president, and I think that he's a malleable politician, and that there's a really good chance that the moderates in the Senate, Democratic moderates and Republicans, would work together to fix the problems that we're talking about right now.
Well, we shall see what happens for the balance of the year, and we always appreciate your economic acumen and knowing the numbers and the statistics. Thanks for joining today. I think this wraps up our conversation, so thank you for joining Spotlight, and thanks, Kevin, for being with us today. We really appreciate it.
Great to be here.
Thank you for watching Total Spectrum Spotlight. For more information about Total Spectrum, please visit us at totalspectrumsga.com. Total Spectrum, strategies uniquely focused on your success.